There's something people often misunderstand about empaths. They assume that emotional sensitivity is synonymous with weakness, that empathy, because it seeks to understand, must always submit, that those who feel deeply are destined to be manipulated by those who feel only for themselves. And it's precisely that false assumption that narcissists exploit. But here's the brutal truth. The empath, once awakened, becomes the narcissist's most dangerous adversary, not through violence, not through confrontation, but through the devastating clarity of self-awareness. You see, the empath begins the relationship in a state of unconscious giving. They interpret the narcissist's neediness as vulnerability, their manipulation as woundedness, their exploitation as a cry for help. Empaths want to heal, to understand, to make sense of what seems chaotic and contradictory. So they bend, they sacrifice, they tolerate things no one should have to tolerate, all in the name of love or loyalty or hope. And for a while, the narcissist thrives on this. They feed off of it. Because empaths offer what the narcissist cannot generate within themselves: unconditional attention, emotional resonance, and a willingness to prioritize another's pain above their own. But this is where the story changes. The empath, after enough cycles of abuse and confusion, begins to wake up. And the first thing they see, truly see, is that they're in a rigged game. A game where their kindness is weaponized against them, where their compassion is twisted into obligation, where their ability to forgive is not honored but expected. This moment of awakening is not loud. It's not theatrical. It often arrives in stillness, in the silence after another argument, or in the numbness that follows yet another betrayal. And in that silence, a thought forms, quiet but powerful. This is not love. From that point on, something irreversible begins. The empath doesn't immediately leave, but they begin to observe. And that observation is lethal to the narcissist. Because narcissists survive on performance. They curate a persona, one designed to provoke admiration or fear or pity, whatever secures control. But they cannot handle being seen, actually seen. And the empath, once awake, sees everything: the contradictions, the manipulation, the projection, the subtle games, the lies wrapped in charm. They see it all, and they stop participating. Now, think about what that means psychologically. The narcissist has built their identity on illusion. They've constructed an emotional architecture that demands constant validation. But when the empath refuses to play along, refuses to be impressed or afraid or seduced, the structure begins to collapse. And that collapse is existential for the narcissist, because their self-improvement isn't grounded in reality. It's grounded in control. And once they lose control over the empath's perception, they lose the ability to maintain their own delusions. This is what makes the empath so dangerous. Not because they attack, but because they see. And that seeing is surgical. It cuts through the narcissist's defenses without saying a word. It destabilizes the entire psychological economy of manipulation. The narcissist begins to panic, not because the empath is doing anything violent or vindictive, but because they've become immune. Immune to guilt trips, immune to charm, immune to the endless cycle of punishment and reward. Now, it's important to recognize this transformation is not about becoming hard-hearted or cold. It's not about mirroring the narcissist's tactics. That's just another trap. The empath's strength lies in remaining empathetic, but no longer exploitable, in retaining compassion, but refusing to carry someone else's emotional dysfunction. That's where true power resides, not in the abandonment of feeling, but in the disciplined stewardship of it. And this power, the awakened empath's power, does something that narcissists cannot predict. It flips the dynamic. The narcissist, once in control, is now exposed. They're left chasing reactions they no longer get. They try anger, and the empath doesn't flinch. They try guilt, and the empath doesn't justify. They try flattery, and the empath doesn't melt. In short, the narcissist begins to psychologically break, not because the empath broke them directly, but because they took away the mirror. The performance ends when the audience stops clapping. This is the brutal truth. Empathy, when conscious, is not weakness. It's revolution. It's the quiet, internal uprising against a system of psychological coercion. And once the empath rises, there is no going back. The narcissist can no longer manipulate what they no longer understand. They can no longer twist what no longer reacts. And that's when their illusion truly crumbles. Not in confrontation, but in irrelevance. So if you are that empath, if you've been made to believe that your softness is a liability, that your compassion is a curse, remember this: your existence threatens every system built on lies. Because you see what others ignore. You feel what others numb. And once you recognize your power, you don't need to fight. You just need to see and then act accordingly. People tend to believe that narcissists are self-sufficient, self-loving, even arrogantly independent. But that's a misreading of the entire psychological structure of narcissism. In reality, narcissists are profoundly dependent, not in the way a child is on a caregiver, which is honest and vulnerable, but in a disguised parasitic way. They need others not just for validation, but for psychological survival. And there's no greater source of that psychological fuel than the empath. See, narcissists don't possess a stable core sense of self. Their identity isn't something they've cultivated through introspection, discipline, or earned accomplishment. It's a patchwork of impressions, manipulations, and emotional reactions from others. It's performative, a mask. They rely on external affirmation to maintain the illusion of grandiosity they cling to. But it's not any kind of affirmation. They need narcissistic supply: attention, praise, fear, admiration, even conflict, anything that reinforces the fantasy that they matter more than they actually do. And this is where the empath enters the picture. Because empaths don't just see people, they feel them. They tune in deeply. They respond with emotional attunement that most people either can't offer or simply. An empath validates not just behavior, but the inner world of the narcissist. They give presence, understanding, sometimes even unconditional support. For the narcissist, this is like heroin. It's not just nice to have, it becomes essential. The empath becomes their emotional oxygen. But here's the catch. The narcissist doesn't appreciate it. They exploit it. Because they don't see the empath as a person, they see them as a function, a mirror, a reflection that must never crack. The narcissist needs the empath to constantly affirm their superiority, to center their emotions, to absorb blame, to collapse their own needs for the sake of the narcissist's illusion. And the empath, especially early on, does this willingly, not because they're weak, but because they genuinely believe they're helping. They think they're loving someone into healing, but they're not. They're feeding a dysfunction. And this feeding dynamic, this supply chain, is where everything unravels, because it creates a false dependency that looks like love, but isn't. The narcissist becomes addicted to the empath's presence, but simultaneously resents their emotional depth. Why? Because that depth reminds them of their own hollowness. The empath becomes both the drug and the mirror, especially when it stops reflecting back the fantasy. That moment of emotional withdrawal, when the empath stops responding the way they used to, is devastating to the narcissist. It's like cutting off a power source to a machine that never learned to run on its own. Suddenly, the charm no longer works. The gaslighting gets questioned. The excuses fall flat. And the narcissist finds themselves exposed, not to the world, but to themselves. And that is intolerable. The psychological collapse that follows is subtle but profound. The narcissist might lash out, rage, smear campaigns, guilt tripping, or they might collapse into self-pity, weaponizing victimhood to try and suck the empath back into the game. But the truth is, they're spiraling, because without the empath's emotional labor, they have no identity to return to. They were never anchored in something real to begin with. And that's the brutal irony here. For all their arrogance, narcissists are completely dependent on the very people they manipulate. They need you to reflect them back to themselves. They need your empathy to justify their cruelty. They need your forgiveness to excuse their patterns. But the minute you become aware of that dynamic, the minute you start to see it for what it is, you begin to take back power they never deserved to hold. And what does that withdrawal look like? It's not loud. It's not vengeful. It's the slow, deliberate act of refusing to engage on their terms. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending against accusations. You stop participating in circular conversations designed to keep you doubting your own reality. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. The narcissist begins to disintegrate, not because you attacked them, but because you no longer allow them to feed off your soul. Now, I want to make something very clear. This isn't about being cruel. It's not about becoming emotionally detached in the name of revenge. It's about reclaiming your energy from a system that was never sustainable. It's about recognizing that real love, healthy, mature, adult love, is mutual. It's reciprocal. It involves boundaries, truth, responsibility, and freedom. A narcissist offers none of that. What they offer is performance, and the only way to end the performance is to stop being the audience. You see, the empath's real power is not in how much they can feel. It's in their ability to withdraw that feeling when it's being exploited. It's the decision to no longer nourish what only consumes. And that decision, though it may feel like the most difficult thing you'll ever do, is also the most liberating. Because once you no longer exist as a mirror for the narcissist, you begin to exist fully as yourself. And that is the one thing a narcissist cannot survive. Let's talk about something that cuts to the core of narcissistic psychology, something rarely discussed but devastatingly effective once understood. It's the idea that the empath, by standing in truth without aggression, without theatricality, exposes the narcissist not through war, but through stillness. And one of the most disarming forms of that stillness is silence. Now, silence isn't passive. It's not a retreat. It's not apathy. It's discipline. It's strategy. And perhaps most importantly, it's restraint. See, the narcissist is addicted to provocation. Their emotional economy is built on eliciting reactions, whether that's admiration, outrage, guilt, confusion, or fear. It doesn't matter what kind of emotional energy it is, as long as it's about them. That's the currency. Attention. Acknowledgement. It reinforces the narrative that they're the center of gravity in the room, the dominant voice in the conversation, the final authority in the dynamic. But when you stop reacting, when you go quiet, not with bitterness or sarcasm, but with purposeful neutrality, you effectively deny them access to that power source. And that silence isn't just a void, it's a mirror. And they hate mirrors that don't flatter. They hate being faced with a version of themselves they can't control. And your silence, your refusal to engage, forces that confrontation. You need to understand something crucial. Narcissists rely on you to carry the emotional labor of the interaction. They provoke because they expect you to explain, to soothe, to defend, to justify. They thrive when you're scrambling to prove your good intentions or correct their false accusations. But when you withhold that response, when you refuse to enter the ring, they're left alone with their projection, their manipulating, and their own hollow noise. And they don't know what to do with that. Now, this is where people get confused. They think silence is weakness. They believe if they don't stand up and shout back, they're letting the narcissist win. But you're not. You're doing something far more powerful. You're showing them that their performance no longer moves you. And that psychologically is devastating to someone whose entire identity is constructed around controlling perception. And I want to be clear, this isn't about playing games or becoming emotionally cold. It's about reclaiming your sovereignty. It's about recognizing that you don't owe your energy to people who exploit it. Silence, when practiced with clarity and conviction, is a boundary, a firm one. It says, I'm not participating in this script anymore. And the narcissist, who depends on you playing your part, suddenly finds themselves without a stage. This doesn't mean they'll give up easily. In fact, your silence often triggers their most desperate tactics. Expect escalation, accusations, threats, even sudden sweetness. This is not because they've changed, it's because they're panicking. Your silence has broken the loop. You've interrupted the cycle. And they need it to restart, because without it, their sense of control collapses. But that's not your problem. That collapse is theirs to face. There's a deeper principle here, one that extends beyond just narcissistic dynamics. Silence forces truth into the light. When you stop defending yourself, the narcissist's projections have nowhere to land. They echo back to them. And for the first time, perhaps ever, they're faced with the emptiness of their accusations. That's why they fight so hard to make you speak, to make you react. Because your reaction gives their illusion life, but your silence lets it die. And it takes courage to do this, especially for empaths, people wired to understand, to explain, to soothe. Silence can feel unnatural. It can feel cold. But that's only because we've been conditioned to equate love with endless dialogue, with emotional overexertion, with fixing what was never ours to fix. But silence, when used wisely, is the boundary that says, I'm not abandoning you. I'm simply refusing to abandon myself anymore. Now, silence isn't always the answer. There are times to speak truth, to confront, to clarify. But in a narcissistic dynamic, when speaking is no longer about truth, but about surviving manipulation, silence becomes a shield. It protects your peace, it breaks their rhythm, and most importantly, it puts the power back where it belongs, with you. What you'll find, if you practice this long enough, is that the narcissist will either escalate into collapse or fade into irrelevance. Either way, the power dynamic shifts. You're no longer caught in a loop of reaction. You're no longer defined by their emotional weather. And when you get to that place where silence is no longer empty, but full of self-respect, you'll realize the narcissist never had power. You gave it. And now you're taking it back. So, here's the takeaway. If the narcissist's weapon is provocation, your greatest counterweapon is silence. Not out of fear, not out of indifference, but out of strength. Silence isn't the absence of voice. It's the presence of discernment. Use it wisely and watch their illusion crumble under the weight of your stillness. Let's talk about emotional neutrality. Not apathy, not coldness, but a kind of psychological mastery that few people understand, and even fewer are willing to practice, especially when they've been entangled with a narcissist. Because what the narcissist wants, more than anything, is to control the emotional atmosphere. They're like psychological chemists, constantly dropping little provocations into the beaker of your mind just to see if you'll erupt. And when you do, when you flinch, when you cry, when you shout or withdraw, it confirms something deeply comforting to them, that they still have access to your psyche, that your emotions are still, in some way, under their influence. But emotional neutrality breaks that spell. It's an unexpected form of power because it rewrites the unspoken contract that exists in narcissistic relationships. That contract, though never stated, always implied, says, I will dictate the tone and you will respond accordingly. If I'm cruel, you'll try harder. If I'm silent, you'll panic. If I gaslight you, you'll defend yourself into exhaustion. If I give you breadcrumbs of affection, you'll come running. But emotional neutrality says, no, I will not participate in this chaos anymore. You don't get to dictate my internal weather. Now, neutrality is not detachment in the spiritual sense. It's not floating above your life like some kind of untouchable monk. It's rooted, grounded. It's the refusal to give your emotional energy away to manipulation. It's choosing again and again to act from principle, not from provocation. See, the narcissist thrives on your emotional reactivity. That's what sustains the game. They push, you pull. They insult, you explain. They disappear, you chase. They rage, you freeze. It's all a dance of control. But the moment you become emotionally neutral, when you start playing that game, you start to notice something remarkable. They begin to unravel. Not because you attacked them, but because you've stopped confirming the illusion that they're important enough to dominate your inner life. Let's look at this psychologically. The narcissist has what you might call a false self, a constructed personality designed to maintain an image of superiority, control, and entitlement. That image is incredibly fragile. It depends almost entirely on external validation, on the reactions of others, to keep it alive. So, when an empath, or anyone with psychological clarity, refuses to react, it creates a void. The narcissist looks into that void and sees nothing reflected back. And that nothing is terrifying to them because it means their image, their mask, isn't working anymore. It's important to understand that emotional neutrality is not suppression. You're not ignoring your feelings. You're not bottling up your pain or pretending to be indifferent. You're just choosing not to act from that pain. There's a difference. You might still feel the sting of a cruel comment, the confusion of a manipulative conversation, the ache of abandonment. But instead of throwing those feelings out into the world in the form of reaction, you hold them, examine them, learn from them, and then you act, not emotionally, but consciously. This terrifies the narcissist because they cannot control what they cannot predict. And emotional neutrality is deeply unpredictable to them. They don't know what to do with someone who doesn't feed the drama, doesn't plead for clarity, doesn't explode or beg or explain. It forces them to face their own emptiness. And that's the one thing they've spent their whole life avoiding. Now let's be honest, this isn't easy. Especially for people who've spent years being conditioned to over-explain, to people-please, to make peace even when there's no war worth fighting. Emotional neutrality requires self-regulation. It requires you to feel the storm without becoming the storm. It asks you to recognize when someone is trying to provoke you and to choose stillness instead of chaos. But once you start to practice this, you begin to feel the shift. You begin to realize that silence, stillness, and neutrality are not weaknesses, they're weapons. Quiet, steady, and devastating to the illusion of control that narcissists try to maintain. In many ways, emotional neutrality is a spiritual discipline. It's the practice of not letting your soul be hijacked by someone else's dysfunction. It's refusing to let their chaos become your compass. And that kind of clarity, that kind of self-possession is what ultimately breaks the psychological hold they have on you, not because you fought them harder, but because you stopped playing their game entirely. You see, the narcissist doesn't know how to navigate a world where they aren't at the center. They don't know how to exist in a space where they can't extract emotional supply. And emotional neutrality says, this space, my mind, my heart, it's not yours to manipulate anymore. That's not just psychological freedom. That's the beginning of personal sovereignty. So, here's the truth. When you stop reacting, you start reclaiming. You reclaim your time, your peace, your dignity, and over time, the narcissist fades, not because they've changed, but because your emotional silence has made them irrelevant. Let's explore something that cuts deeper than most people are willing to admit. The narcissist's dependency on the very people they try to destroy. That's not an exaggeration, it's a paradox, and one that most people completely miss. The narcissist, for all their bravado, their grandiosity, and their emotional manipulation, is psychologically and existentially dependent on the people they seek to control, especially empaths. And it's not because they value those people in any meaningful sense, it's because they need them to sustain their fragile illusion of dominance. See, There's a myth that narcissists are truly independent, that they don't care what people think, that they live in some elevated state of superiority. That's nonsense. What we're actually dealing with is a person whose entire sense of self is externally constructed and maintained. Strip away the audience, and the narcissist begins to disintegrate. They don't know who they are without someone else to reflect a carefully curated image back at them. That's not confidence. That's dependency in its most parasitic form. And here's the twisted irony. They seek out people with depth, people with compassion, emotional intelligence, creativity, moral conviction, not to admire those traits, but to drain them. They latch on to what they lack. The empath becomes a kind of emotional battery. The narcissist plugs in, drains what they need: attention, admiration, sympathy. And when the battery runs low, they panic or discard or manipulate. But the cycle always returns to one key truth. They cannot function without someone else's psychological energy. That's where your power comes in. Because once you understand that the narcissist needs you in order to maintain their illusion, the dynamic begins to shift. Not in an arrogant way, not in a tit-for-tat, I'm better than you kind of way, but in a quiet, rooted, deeply aware way. You begin to see that your energy is not something to be given freely to those who weaponize it against you. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because if you're the kind of person who attracts narcissists, you've probably been trained, consciously or unconsciously, to believe that your role is to heal others, to fix the broken, to show grace where there's cruelty. That's a noble instinct. But when it becomes unbounded, when you keep giving even after it becomes clear that you're being used, it turns into something toxic. Not just for you, but for the person exploiting you, because you enable their dysfunction. You become the mirror that keeps the illusion alive. It's a difficult thing to admit, especially for those who identify as empaths or caregivers. The realization that your empathy has been used as a leash rather than a gift. But once you confront that, once you reclaim your emotional energy and stop feeding the narcissist's illusion, they start to lose control, not just over you, but over themselves. Psychologically, this is devastating to the narcissist. Why? Because without someone to manipulate, their identity begins to collapse. The false self needs constant reflection, constant praise, or at the very least, constant reaction, positive or negative. It doesn't matter. Either one feeds the machine. But when you step away from the machine, when you refuse to react, when you stop offering your emotional labor as fuel, the whole system starts to short circuit. They become agitated, confused, angry, and eventually desperate. That's when they try to bait you. That's when they'll use guilt, nostalgia, passive aggression, anything to reestablish the bond. Because to them, silence isn't just disrespect, it's annihilation. They cease to exist without an audience. Now let's be clear. This doesn't mean you're responsible for their collapse. You're not their savior, and you're not their executioner either. You're just someone who has finally recognized that their survival mechanism is predicated on your subjugation. That's not love, that's psychological colonization, and it needs to end. So what do? You reclaim your emotional energy by placing it where it belongs, in your healing, your purpose, your vision for a future that isn't filtered through someone else's dysfunction. You stop giving explanations to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop reacting to provocations that are designed only to pull you back into the drama. You stop asking, why do they do this, and start asking, why do I tolerate it? And that's the real shift. Not just breaking free from the narcissist, but breaking free from the role you've been playing. The role of the fixer, the role of the forgiver, the one who stays just a little longer, tries just a little harder. There comes a point when staying in that role becomes a betrayal of yourself. And that betrayal has to stop before any real freedom can begin. Here's the brutal truth. The narcissist needs you far more than you ever needed them. Not because you're weak, but because you're strong. You have something they cannot generate on their own, authentic emotional depth. And they know that. That's why they tried to claim you, but now you know. Now you see. And when you finally stop giving them what they crave most, your emotional energy, they don't just lose power over you. There is something deeply counterintuitive about healing from narcissistic abuse, something that most people don't talk about, and it's this. The very qualities that made you a target are the same ones that will set you free. Not by changing them, but by owning them with conscious clarity. Your empathy, your sensitivity, your depth of perception. These weren't weaknesses, they were weapons you didn't know you were holding. And the final piece of the puzzle is learning to turn inward and direct that power toward yourself. You see, the narcissist's game was never really about love or relationship. It was about control. It was about siphoning attention and energy to prop up their fragile, inflated self. And you, with your instinct to care, to nurture, to understand, became the perfect vessel for that. But here's the thing. The most dangerous empaths aren't the ones who fight back with rage or revenge. It's the ones who no longer need the narcissist to explain themselves. The ones who stop chasing closure, stop asking why, and start focusing entirely on their own healing. Because silence in this case isn't emptiness, it's reclamation. When you stop reacting, you're no longer feeding the machine. And when you stop explaining, you're stepping out of the manipulative dance entirely. Narcissists don't know what to do with people who refuse to play the game. If they insult you and you don't flinch, if they bait you and you don't bite, if they vanish and you don't chase them, they're faced with their worst fear, irrelevance. And there is no greater punishment for someone addicted to attention than being denied an audience. Now, this kind of silence isn't passive. It's not a form of giving up. It's an active choice, a psychological boundary forged in fire. It says, I no longer derive my identity from this dynamic. That's not indifference, that's liberation. Because the narcissist's power never came from who they were, it came from what you believed they were. It was the illusion that held you hostage. And breaking that illusion doesn't happen through confrontation. It happens in solitude, in stillness, in silence. Think about it. Every moment you spent explaining yourself to them, every time you tried to prove your worth, every argument you thought you could win, it was all part of the same trap. The need for validation, the hope that maybe this time they'll understand. But that cycle only deepens your entanglement. Because narcissists feed on your need for resolution. They don't want to fix things. They want to keep things broken. Broken means control. Broken means leverage. Broken means you stay. But when you no longer need them to get it, when you decide that their lack of empathy is no longer your problem to solve, then you begin to repair what was really damaged, your sense of self. Not the self they mirrored back to you, distorted and confused, but the one you had before the manipulation started, the one that existed in you long before they entered the picture. This isn't about becoming cold or heartless. It's about becoming whole. Wholeness doesn't require constant engagement. Wholeness doesn't chase chaos for the illusion of connection. Wholeness doesn't seek revenge. It seeks peace. And peace is something the narcissist can never give you because they don't have it. You are asking someone lost in their own delusion to meet you in truth. That was never going to happen. So now the work is inward. You stop focusing on how to defeat them, and you start focusing on how to rebuild you. You set boundaries not to punish, but to protect. You prioritize solitude not out of fear, but out of self-respect. You start listening to the voice within you that was silenced for so long, the one that said, "This doesn't feel right," even when you didn't have the words to explain it. And that voice, once nurtured, grows louder. It begins to guide you, not out of reaction, but from alignment. You stop repeating patterns because you're no longer the person who needed those patterns to feel needed. You begin choosing relationships that don't require you to shrink in order to survive. You no longer overextend, over-apologize, over-distance yourself, over-compromise, over-fix it, and then default to a different. You live rooted in the knowledge that you are enough, not because someone finally told you so, but because you finally believed it yourself. That's the moment the narcissist loses their grip. Not when you yell, not when you cry, not when you finally get them to admit what they did. No, it's when you outgrow the game entirely. When you move on without seeking applause or validation. When you rebuild yourself so completely that their absence becomes irrelevant. Because now you see the truth. They never held power. You just hadn't realized you could walk away from the stage. So this is the final disarmament, the deepest revenge, the truest healing. Not in your anger, but in your indifference. Not in your fight, but in your silence. Not in breaking them down, but in building yourself up so profoundly that they can no longer reach you, even if they scream.